Hi, welcome to MMT Mondays on Real Progressives. I'm Jeff Ginter, your host. So tonight, we're rebroadcasting a presentation by Professor Stephanie Kelton entitled Rethinking Capitalism. So it's important to understand capitalism is really the economic system that we have. It's a choice. It's a political choice. It's an economic choice. It's not a natural phenomenon. But the way that Stephanie Kelton explains it, capitalism runs on sales. And she'll explain in deeper quality what she means about that. But basically, anyone's spending becomes someone else's income. You go out to dinner, you spend money. That institution, that restaurant now has income that it uses to pay its employees and to pay its vendors to be able to do what it does. It would not be able to do that. It would close if no one went there and spent their money at that location. So the economy, capitalism, runs on sales. That's what we have created. And I want to say right here, right now, I am not against capitalism per se. I have no problems with someone creating something, having an idea, bringing it to market, selling it, and being able to make a decent living off of what they do. I got no problems with that. I have massive problems with unfettered capitalism, with capitalism running amok, where profit is the only thing that matters, and a government that sides with business because it was purchased to do so, that will side with them to do whatever they want to do, no matter the ecological damage, no matter the wealth inequality that results, no matter in the suffering, no matter what. Profits is what matters. That's the only thing that matters. That is unfettered capitalism. That is greed run amok. In fact, greed is too small a word to describe what it is, because you do that long enough and you produce people who actually think that they are worth it, that if you made $1 billion, that you made it, that you are the reason why that money was generated and you earned it. You worked 1 billion times harder than someone who only earned $1. That is dangerous, dangerous thinking for society and for being able to function on this planet, on this delicate ecosystem that sustains our lives. So capitalism, fine. Unfettered capitalism, bad. And we also have to understand that there are some places that capitalism works and some places where it cannot, where it is anathema to whatever it is you're trying to do. So you want to sell me a house? Capitalism, fine. You want to sell me a pencil, you want to sell me a car, you want to sell me a vacation, whatever it is you want to sell me, that doesn't mean life or death to me, but it could mean the difference between having a comfortable life and a sparse life. Okay, fine, capitalism. But even under those conditions, the federal government has to be able to put restrictions so that everyone can enjoy in the benefits of capitalism. So that everyone can be an entrepreneur, everyone can bring their ideas to a market and freely be able to compete in that market. Right now, we have oligarchy who has controlled Congress to make sure that whatever laws get passed are favorable to them, and any laws that are already on the books, like antitrust laws, get ignored. Because it is a political choice to create a law. It is a political choice to prosecute people for violating those laws. We have antitrust that if it was actually enforced, media corporations would be broken up like that. 6 corporations own 90% of the media in this country. That's down from 50 corporations back in 1983. This should not be allowed. You should not have the vast majority of the information hitting our eyes and ears coming from only 6 sources. That is dangerous to democracy. But we're allowing it. We're allowing it. You know the old expression, treason doth never prosper. Because if it prospered, none dare call it treason. So you can say that these people are doing immoral things, but hey, it's not illegal. Well, you bought the politicians to make the laws to make sure that it is legal. Or in those instances where it actually is illegal, you pay the politicians to look the other way. And then you purchase the media corporations to only have one dominant narrative to make sure that we look the other way. So capitalism, fine, but with regulations so that everyone can share, everyone can benefit, and benefit greatly. Not saying you should not be able to be rich. I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to have a great house and a great life if you had a great idea and you organized the resources that were available to be able to bring this idea to market. And we all said, hey, man, that's an awesome idea. I want to get that. And then you win. You get all this money, you get all these resources that come back to you, and you've got the life, and you've got the house, and the car, and the family, and the kids, and the vacations. You earned that, but you didn't have to suppress wages. You didn't have to stand on the backs of people to make sure that they lost. You didn't have to keep other people out of the market to make sure that yours was the only one that was really available. So it wasn't really so much that we thought, hey, what a wonderful idea, so much as, well, I guess that's the only idea that's out there and I need to fix this problem, so whatever. Meanwhile, all these other problems that we have in society aren't being addressed by the capitalist class because there's no real profit at the other end of that equation, but we still have these problems. Capitalism has its place. I don't care that you're rich. I care how you got rich. I care what you do with your wealth, and I care how you maintain your riches. I don't care that you're rich. But we have to have a conversation about morality and what we're going to do about the abuses of power that we have right now. And then we have to recognize that there are places where capitalism has no place. Places like healthcare. No one with their right mind is saying that you should not be able to be in healthcare and not be well off, because it does take a massive expenditure of your personal resources, of time and energy, to be able to acquire the skills to be able to provide the life-saving services that we need. Of course you should be compensated. Of course you should be compensated well. But if that compensation has to come from the pockets of people who do not issue their own currency, who do have to beg, borrow, steal, earn that money, and then turn it over to you, that's a problem. That's when you get disparities of care and disparities of outcome. So the federal government, who creates the currency, who has no financial limitations, only limitations of resource availability. Put it another way, full employment and inflation. Only they can marshal the needed resources to produce whatever outcome we're looking for. So there are some places, healthcare, education, infrastructure. There are some areas of the economy where it is just simply unacceptable to put profit as the motive for getting those results. Because the results you're going to get are not what you're looking for, and it's going to be disastrous in life and death for individuals and a society. In some areas where it's fine. And once you understand how federal finance functions, you can decide for yourself where you think the capitalism works well and where you think there should be a firewall. And tonight, Stephanie Kelton is going to give her talk, give you a walkthrough of federal finance and how she thinks capitalism should be redone. Be back at the end. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Good. They are allowed to talk because this is going to be interactive, I hope. I have a big task in that I have 45 minutes, and I want to try to cover a lot of ground with you in 45 minutes. So very quickly, thank you to Mariana. Thank you to the organizers, the invitation to come and be part of this incredible course offering that Mariana has designed. I love that I get to come and talk a little bit about a chapter that I contributed to the book that I guess is serving as the core textbook in this course. So, but I don't want to stand up here and repeat what's in the chapter because that would be boring for you. And you were supposed to already be familiar with the chapter. So I am going to give you that broad brushstroke, sort of the arc of what the chapter does, but then I want to take you where the chapter doesn't go, which is a little bit beyond, but building on the arguments that I laid out in the chapter, okay? So in this chapter, how many of you will confess to having read the chapter? I won't ask you questions about it, I won't. Okay, so in the chapter, I refer to, and I think I have a subheading called Deficits Save the World, right? You're nodding, so you remember that. This is the title of a blog post that Paul Krugman wrote in the aftermath of the financial crisis and the Great Recession that followed. And, you know, the world was sort of teetering on this, what are we going to do now that deficits have exploded because economies crashed? And when economies crash, deficits automatically increase. Governments don't have to actively do things to push deficits up when the economy gets weak. When the economy gets weak and people are losing their jobs, their incomes go to zero. When your incomes go to zero, your federal income taxes go to zero. You don't have any income, you don't pay income taxes. So taxes automatically fall off a cliff in a weak economy, and spending to support the unemployed, right, and a weak economy automatically go up. People qualify for programs like food assistance and unemployment compensation and housing assistance. You lose your home, right? So spending goes up automatically, tax receipts go down automatically. The difference between what the government spends and what it collects in taxes is the deficit. And so deficits automatically increase, in fact, explode, because the downturn was so severe. And so people looked at what was happening, including many professional economists, and they said, it's time to panic because deficits have widened and this is a bad thing, right? We must begin to rein in the deficit. So actively taking steps to try to balance the budget. How? Cutting government spending, raising taxes. What's the word that got used all the time? Austerity. I heard someone say it. Right? So attempting to force your economy to balance your budget. You see what I did? Forcing the economy to balance the budget instead of allowing the budget to rebalance the broken economy. Okay? And allowing those deficits to not only emerge, but maybe actively driving them up. And maybe that would have been a good thing. And most professional economists today in the US, I think, agree that deficits that were run during the Great Recession were too small, that in fact they should have been larger, that had they been larger, the economy would have recovered more quickly, and that because we didn't do the right things, using the government's fiscal capacity to help stabilize and recover the economy, we ended up with years of slow growth, foregone output, lost income, lost wealth, lost savings, jobs that didn't recover, and ultimately, President Trump. That happens in part because of the angst and the insecurities that built up and the dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs for millions and millions of people. Okay, I'm going to use the US context here, but obviously this happens elsewhere around the world and across Europe, and you've lived it, so you know this, okay? So deficits save the world mostly because they automatically happened, and that put a floor under how bad things were allowed to get. But then we turned against them, and we started actively trying to fight against the deficits instead of recognizing that those deficits were doing good things, right? There was a positive role that those deficits played in the broader economy, and we should have allowed them to increase and expand even further, all right? But we didn't do that. And why didn't we do that? Because of fears about government deficits, about the national debt, beliefs that are deeply entrenched, that deficits are evidence of bad behavior, irresponsible, right? That in fact the right thing to do is to try to push the budget toward balance. And so the debate became, here and around the world, one that largely took place between two views, right? You had the deficit hawks. Do you use that term here? If you're hawkish on the deficit, you are hardcore anti-deficit spending. You want the budget balanced now and always. Never spend a penny more than you collect in revenue. I'm a deficit hawk, right? I want budgets balanced immediately and to stay balanced. Then there's this other camp that says, well, that's a little extreme. I mean, sometimes the economy gets weak and the government needs to do something. Pull the fiscal lever, cut some taxes, increase some spending. And that actually is a good thing to do. Yes, we agree that, over the business cycle, we would like the budget to be balanced, but we're willing to tolerate some deficits when the economy is weak, okay? This is the deficit dove position. So austerity later versus austerity now. Those are largely, that's how the conversation played out between these two dominant positions. So what I'm going to suggest is that there's a third voice that needs to be elevated. And in the past, I coined the phrase the deficit owls, and it sort of, made some headlines, front page of the Washington Post and that sort of stuff. People picked it up. I said, what the heck is a deficit owl? And I said, well, you need a new bird in this aviary because these other dodos, right, are getting us bad policy. So what does the deficit owl see that the hawks and the doves are missing? And that's what I want to try to build on in the conversation that will follow. So my argument, owls are supposed to be wise, right? They can see things that the other birds are missing because their little heads go all the way around. They can see in the dark, right? So there are advantages. There are things that the others are missing that I think needs to be part of the conversation. So I want to move forward with that because my position is that fiscal policy is not something that you reach for, break glass in case of emergency. Then we use fiscal policy, but in normal times, we rely on central banks to steer the economy. My view is that that's not the right way to do policy. That fiscal policy should be a permanent tool in the toolkit, and that we ought to calibrate the government's budget to deliver mission-oriented spending goals, right? So figure out what it is you want to do in your economy, set goals, make them transparent, have mission-oriented budgeting, and then draft a budget that will allow you to achieve those goals. So you're using the budget to balance broader conditions in the economy instead of trying to force your economy to balance your budget. Yes? Okay, let's do it. So here's where the conversation breaks down. Somebody comes in and says, we should be doing X, Y, Z in order to promote a good economy. But how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? And then the record scratches, or you don't know record players because they're so old, right? The needle on the record player goes, and that's it. The conversation stops. And this is what happens here and elsewhere around the world. We want to do all of these things. They're mission-oriented goals. How are you going to pay for it? What's behind the question? Behind the question is a belief that the government needs to find the money, that it must somehow come up with money in order to fund programs, okay? So we have to talk about this. Is this the right way to begin with this question about money and how governments finance things? I argue no. And so I want to move us beyond, starting with this question, which is the question we always begin with, okay? Here is the problem. This is a short video. The sound works, we checked it, but for the next couple of minutes, you're going to listen to this and then we'll talk about it.
Taking money from our children and borrowing from China.
Take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt that we are going to have to pay back. That's irresponsible. It's unpatriotic.
The government's irresponsible spending is turning us into slaves. You might well literally lock us into chains, at least our children.
We got to deal with this big long-term debt problem, or it will deal with us.
And it is
I'm asking you, join us to stop this fiscal train wreck. Join us to protect our children from an inferior standard of living from a crushing burden of debt and taxes.
Okay, I don't believe in any of the tax cuts. I didn't want tax cuts for the rich. I didn't even want it for the middle class. Okay, because you know why? Because it puts a $400 billion hole in the budget and we just can't afford it.
And as we discuss deficit reduction, which is clearly a major issue.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future.
And the deficit thing is real, and the debt thing is real. We are really in trouble on it at some point.
Is there a need for comprehensive deficit reduction? The answer is not only yes, but hell yes.
This debt that hangs over our head, a government that spends more money than it takes in. That's not sustainable.
You know, you cannot cut taxes or increase spending unless you can pay for it.
The math of federal spending does not add up. And we are spending money we do not have.
We have a debt burden that's crushing us.
To me, this is more of a moral issue. You can't steal from your kids and grandkids.
Deficit. We think the deficit and the national debt are at a moral level.
National debt is America's biggest problem.
Does it sound familiar? Does, doesn't it? So if you notice this video, what you saw is a bipartisan chorus. They literally finish each other's sentences, right? And the way the video is put together, it goes Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, which is to say they're all singing from the same hymn book, right? They're preaching the same gospel about the dangers, the risks of government spending more than they take in, running deficits, piling debt upon debt upon debt, the morality play, right? Burdening future generations. It's not fair to our kids and grandkids. The bit you missed were references from President Obama about borrowing from China. So we have discussions about this being a national security threat, a threat to future generations, a threat to our standard of living. I mean, my God, right? This is a disastrophe. That's a word I made up. But here's the problem. All right, so this is what we're up against. But this is so old, right? At some point, if this was right, don't you think there would have been a disaster by now? Okay, this is a cartoon from 1937. This is as far back as I could find, but I'm sure you would find similar cartoons if I could get back a little earlier. But 1937, and what are they complaining about? Ha, 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 36 billion. Look at all those zeros right at the top. If we stack them on end, they would be as high as, you know, a skyscraper or whatever, right? Meaning to scare people about the national debt. This is 1937. Go through to the 1940s. Now we enter World War II, and the debt begins to increase. Okay, so here we are, look. Oh, billions in deficit, billions of debt, no problem. Here we are, 49 billion, and out here is 65 billion. And they're saying, don't worry, the water's fine, come on in, as if it's a joke, right? All of this debt, it's a disaster. Now move to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan. Massive tax cuts, massive buildup of military defense spending, deficits increase, the national debt almost triples. And at the end of Reagan's tenure as president, the cartoons say, let's build a monument to the Reagan presidency. 1.5 trillion is where the national debt is because of Reagan. All right? Again, here are more cartoons, up to 3 trillion. By the time Clinton leaves office, it's 5.7 trillion. Then it goes to 7.5. Oh, please give to the poor United States. We are in debt. Help us. 10 trillion and counting. 13 trillion again with all the zeros. The poor child, right, watching the TV, finding their share of the national debt is $45,000 as it climbs to 14 trillion, 15 trillion. A monster eating through the US of A. Right, 16 trillion, 17 trillion, kicking the can down the curb. Both parties rolling this massive debt over future generations. Now we are interstellar in the size of the national debt at 18 trillion. It doesn't even fit on the planet anymore. It has grown so large. 19 trillion, it's a cancer, right? A cancer. 20 trillion, the Titanic, it's the iceberg ahead, it's inevitable, it's going to end in disaster. 21 trillion, and where we are in the US, any minute now, literally, we're going to hit 22 trillion. Okay? What am I saying? I'm saying for 100 years, and actually it's longer, someone has been crying about the national debt and how the end is near and how it's a crisis. It is always a crisis, no matter what size it is. The end is always near, the sky is always falling, it's always an imminent threat an imminent threat. So what I try to do is to provide some perspective, to get us to contextualize things, to open the other eye, right? Because it's like we go through this analysis with one eye open and the other eye closed. We got to see the other side of the balance sheet. We have to put this deficit and this national debt in some meaningful context instead of just reacting to numbers, right? It's just a number. Maybe it's a negative number, and we all suffer from meganumophobia. That's the fear of very large negative numbers, right? We got to get beyond that, okay? So I want to get us to a point where we can pick up the newspaper, read a headline that says the government debt is at an all-time high, and be like, okay, that seems fine. Okay, so how do we get there? How do we have a different conversation? It requires a paradigm shift. It does. We have to change the way we're talking about and thinking about some things. The biggest mistake is the tendency to think of the government's finances as similar to our own, right? To liken the government's budget to our individual household budget. That's where all the problems begin. Because we all know at a personal level that we couldn't go on spending more than we take in year after year, borrowing, increasing our debt, and expect things to turn out well for us as people. Okay, that won't end well. It wouldn't end well for a business. It wouldn't end well for us. But we then say, therefore, it must be the case that it can't work for the federal government either, right? Because their budget is like our budget. It is not like our budget. And the biggest difference between them and us is that they are the issuer of the currency, and the rest of us are merely users of the currency. You all are using the British pound, but the British government issues the British pound. Where else could it come from? In the US, I use the dollar, but the federal government of the United States issues the US dollar. It doesn't come from China. Right? It can only come. In fact, the government gives itself the exclusive right to create the currency. If I try to make it in my basement or my garage, it's called counterfeiting, and they go to jail. Right? It is not legal for me to create the US dollar. Only the US government has that right. Okay? Call it a super patent. So because they issue the currency, they can't go broke like a household or a private business. There's a fundamental difference here. So in the time that remains, which is how much time? 20 minutes. Okay, in the time that remains, I'm going to tackle 5 questions. I'm going to try to do it in about 5 minutes each, but I'll speed up in the interest of time. Okay, so these are the 5 questions that I want to tackle. First, most people who have a visceral reaction to the idea of governments running budget deficits cannot tell you what the deficit is. They don't even understand the deficit. They just don't like the word. The word itself has a connotation that's negative, right? Deficit, I'm out of something, I'm short something. There's a negative connotation. Let's talk about what the deficit really is. And the same thing with the debt. There's a negative connotation. People don't believe that debt could be good. Debt can only be one thing: risky, bad, right? Dangerous. So we have to talk about that. The idea that we're dependent upon foreign interests, right? That makes us feel nervous and anxious and vulnerable. The idea that what if, China refuses to lend us dollars and they close the dollar window and then we can't spend anymore because they won't let us have dollars. We got to talk about that. Do we eventually have to pay it back though? I mean, surely we can't just have debt forever. Eventually you have to pay it off, right? That's what people say. Talk about that. And then the last question is the one that opens up all of the possibilities, all of the space where we can have, I think, a much better, much more useful debate about government policy when we talk about, in real terms, what it is we can afford. We get away from all the obsession with money and deficits. Okay, so first, what is a government deficit? Let's say, for example, the government spends 10 into the economy. So let's let that happen. Here's the government spending 10 into the economy. Now, since we're here in the UK, and we're not using these little dollars, we're using pounds. Okay, so I'm going to play the role of government. And did I do this right? Did I make 10 of these? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, these are pounds. I'm playing the role of the British government. They asked me not to do that, so I'm not walking in front of that screen. I'm going around the screen. I'm spending 10 into the British economy. That's you guys. You're all the households. You're all the private businesses. You're the British economy. Now I've spent 10 into the economy as government, all right? You have 10, but now I'm going to tax you, you see. So suppose I raise taxes and I collect 4 of those back. Give me that 4. So now I've collected taxes. So what have I done? I spent more into the economy than I taxed back out. I ran a deficit. You're all saying, you're whispering it. I ran a deficit. I did this very horrible thing called deficit spending. What do you have? Where'd you get those? My deficit is your what? Say it with me. Surplus. My deficit is your surplus. How about that? Right? What would have happened if I balanced my budget? What would have happened if I spent 10 in and then I taxed 10 back out? You would have nothing. Nothing. But because I ran a budget deficit, you get the mirror image of that. You get those 6. Okay? So I'm going to record -6 on my books because I'm government, but you get to record a +6 on your books. Not bad, huh? Pretty good deal. Now you might say, hang on, what was that spending for? That's a good question. Was it aimed at improving material well-being for people in the British economy? Or did it go to the fat cats and did it widen and exacerbate income and wealth inequality? Did it do something useful to promote longer-term growth, right? Greening of the economy, whatever it is that your missions are. Those are important questions. But one thing is for sure, somebody got made better off in financial terms because of my deficit. Who gets it and what the spending was about, that matters. Okay, but the bottom line is somebody ended up with a financial surplus they wouldn't have had but for my deficit. So you all use the term, what did we say? Not red ink, in the red, right? Government's in the red. Government's in the red, government's in the red. We got to stop that. Well, but when they're in the red, you're in the black because their deficits are your surpluses. So in the US, we use the phrase red ink. So their red ink is our black ink. This is actual data for the US. The government's budget balance is here in red. The private sector is in black. And you can see how they move opposite to one another. Okay? So this is an important point that gets missed because we go through with one eye closed, only looking at what's happening to the government's balance sheet without paying attention to what's happening to the non-government's balance sheet. And that's where we are, right? We're in the non-government part of the economy. So those deficits that exploded when the economy got weak during the Great Recession, 10%, 11% of US GDP, massive deficits. This caused hysteria because people saw these massive deficits, right? Diving down into negative. But they didn't pay attention to the huge surpluses they were producing in the rest of the economy. And that's what allowed the economy to recover. People accumulated financial balances that helped them recover their incomes, pay down debt, right? Restore their balance sheets. So they were good deficits. They were useful. They were necessary. So here we are in the US today. The Republicans just passed some of the biggest tax cuts in US history. People are beginning to panic because those tax cuts are projected to increase budget deficits. So now we're looking at the possibility of trillion-dollar deficits, annual budget deficits in the future years, right? And so headlines like this in the Wall Street Journal, why trillion-dollar deficits could be the new normal. Now people read a headline like that and they get nervous. Trillion-dollar deficits. But what if we just rewrite that headline and we report the same information, but we give it to you from your balance sheet position instead of from the government? So what am I going to do? Watch that word deficit. You see that? I'm reporting the same information. So now the headline reads, why trillion-dollar surpluses could be the new normal. Now you read that headline and say, all right, let's have some trillion-dollar surpluses, right? That sounds fine to me. And it could be fine, okay? But it's just about perspective. So depending on where you stand, a thing can look like one thing or it can look like another thing. If If you're standing looking at it from the perspective of the government, it looks like a deficit. You turn around and look at it from another angle, looks like a surplus, right? It's about perspective. All right, so let's talk about the national debt. What is the national debt? The deficit is the annual difference between what the government spends into the economy and what it taxes back out. That's the deficit. The national debt is something different. People often conflate them. So what is the national debt? Let's start by remembering where those 6 came from. All right? Whenever I run a deficit as government, I borrow. All right? There is something called a borrowing operation that accompanies deficit spending. So I put 100 in, well, in this case 10. I taxed 4 back out. I left 6 behind. My deficit was 6. So now I say, okay, I ran a deficit of 6, so I have to auction off bonds, treasuries, right? So I gotta see if anybody wants 6 of these right here. So I'm gonna hold them up. Now the cool thing about these is that they are government promissory notes, but they pay interest, you see, and those don't, okay? So I say, would anyone like to swap some of their non-interest bearing currency for some of this cool stuff, right? These treasury notes. And sure enough, there are always people scrambling. In fact, there are never enough of these to go around. The auctions are always oversubscribed. There are more people bidding for these than I have available. So you're going to give me these 6, and I'm going to give you those. This is voluntary. I don't have to do this, right? But when I run a deficit, by practice, I make a swap, and I offer treasury securities. And that's what the national debt is. So now you're holding 6 big pink papers instead of 6 little pink papers. That's all the borrowing is. That's all the national debt is. So a way to describe the national debt is to say the national debt is the money that was spent into the economy and not taxed back that is currently being saved in the form of treasuries. That's all the national debt is. It's saved, your savings. It's an investment vehicle that gives you a way to save pounds, for us dollars, in the form of a financial asset that pays you a little bit of interest over time. Yeah? That's all the national debt is. The dollars or the pounds spent into the economy, not taxed back, currently being saved in the form of treasuries. Okay? So we have this thing, I don't know if you have one, but many years ago, I think a billionaire paid to put this debt clock up in Times Square in New York City. So this huge clock that ran in real time, tick, 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 the numbers would change, and it kept track of the national debt, right there in Times Square. Prime real estate to remind everyone, so that when you're walking around trying to be happy and see a Broadway show, you have to walk by this daunting clock that's reminding you of the monster, right, that's growing and will eat your children at one point. So we had this debt clock, and it's meant to scare people, right? Big numbers. So now that we know what the national debt is, we can take that debt clock and just rename it. So watch the name here. It just becomes a savings clock. Doesn't that sound better? If we don't call it the national debt clock and we just call it the US dollar saving clock or the British pound saving clock, then you can watch the numbers grow and say, oh, people are increasing their, safe holding of British pounds. I'm okay with that, right? That's all it is. So then we have the China question. Well, what about all the bonds that are held by the Chinese and other foreign countries? Okay, surely that's a problem. So let's address that. In the case of the US, China holds lots of US bonds. Where did they get them? Why do they have them? They have them because China has oriented its economy for many years around export-led growth. They want to make things, manufacture things in China, put their people in factories, working and producing stuff, using their time, resources, energy, talents, so forth, making stuff that they don't keep and consume and enjoy for themselves. They put it in a container and load it on a ship and ship it to America and other countries, yes? And in exchange, they receive what? US dollars. Okay, so the real goods and services come in to the countries they export to, and then they receive payment in the form of somebody's currency, yeah? So what China gets in exchange for their real goods and services that they manufacture for us is effectively a checking account at the Federal Reserve, at our central bank. So they get numbers in a bank account owned by China, right? These are your dollars. China then does what you just did. They say, well, I don't care as much for the pink paper, the light pink. I would prefer some of the dark pink paper. So we debit their checking account and we credit their securities account, which is a savings account, which is US Treasuries. So China, like others, can swap non-interest-bearing cash, currency, for the interest-bearing treasuries. Is that a problem? No. The only thing we owe China is a bank statement. Okay? Could it become a problem? Yes. If you are allowing domestic unemployment to increase because jobs and factories are moving abroad and Americans aren't buying the goods and services being produced domestically, but instead buying goods produced by foreign countries, then if you don't do something about it, it could cost you in terms of employment domestically. So it's not that you don't have to worry at all about trade imbalances or any of that kind of stuff. But my point is, it doesn't matter that China has these treasuries. It doesn't mean that we can't service the debt, that somehow this makes us vulnerable, that you know, it's a problem for the US that China owns some of our securities, okay? So sometimes people will say, what if China decides to stop buying treasuries? What if they decide? The idea being that if China won't buy US treasuries, then we can't have dollars, and then we can't afford to spend. This is complete nonsense, okay? Remember, if China decided that they don't want to buy any more US treasuries, what would that mean? Well, it would probably mean that China has decided that they don't want to manufacture and net export to the US, okay? So let's say they decide to keep everything they're making, or they don't want to export to the US. What does that mean? That means they're not going to end up with dollars, because if they don't sell us their stuff, they're not going to get dollars. And if they don't get dollars, they're not going to want to convert them into treasuries. So if China decides they don't want any more treasuries, what it's really saying is China's deciding they don't want to net export to the US. Is that a problem? Maybe, right? Because having access to cheap imports is a benefit to US consumers, because your dollar goes further if you can pay less for some of the things that you're buying, right? So if China doesn't want to continue to make things and sell them inexpensively to American consumers, we either have to find another country who will step in and do what China's been doing for us for many years and make the cheap goods and send them to us, or make them ourselves, likely at a higher price. And so it could be inflationary. See, so there's the risk there, which is the potential for inflation, which is real and legitimate thing to worry about, but not debt service, right? It's not the debt itself that's the risk. So Steve Mnuchin is our Treasury Secretary currently, and he was asked about this. Are you worried? Do you worry that at some point China could either start dumping treasuries or refuse, lose interest in buying them? And he said, I'm not losing any sleep over it. That was his response, and I think that's the correct one. So we've dealt with that. All right. Mostly what this is about is politics. It's not about economics. These debates that we have about the national debt and deficits, that you saw two sides, right, beating each other up over this issue. It's a political cudgel. It's a useful rhetorical weapon when you're running against someone to say, your party drove up the deficit and added to the national debt, and so vote for us and we'll not do that, and we'll fix it. And then that party gets elected And then inevitably they run deficits and the debt goes up. And then the other party goes, you were fiscally irresponsible, vote for us and we'll fix it. And it just goes back and forth, right? It's political, it's politically convenient. So one of my favorite things to do when I was working on the Hill in the Senate was to ask members of Congress and staffers, if you had a magic wand and you could wave that magic wand and eliminate the entire national debt, it would be gone tomorrow. 22 trillion now, remember? Make it all go away just with the wave of a wand. Would you do it? What do you think they said? What do you think they said? Heck yeah, I'd wave that wand, make it go away. Say, okay, so you're enthusiastic about paying off or eliminating the debt. What if I give you a different wand and I say, if you want to wave this wand, you can eradicate the world of US treasuries. No more treasury securities anywhere in the world. They're not in pensions, portfolios, you know, they're just gone. Would you wave the wand? What do you think they said? So you say no, and some said no, and some said, huh? Like, I don't understand the question. And then I would say, that's okay, you already answered it. You see the problem? You do, because you found the humor in this, right? What's the problem with the answer? If they say yes to the first question and no to the second, what's the problem? It's the same question. How is it the same question? Because the entire outstanding national debt is nothing more than all of those safe assets that are being held in the form of US treasuries. So you can't eliminate the debt without eliminating the most important financial instrument in the global financial system. The most important, US treasuries. They wouldn't exist. So you got a problem if your aim is to pay off the debt or eliminate the debt and also keep the treasuries, okay? So let's talk about historically what has happened, because we've actually tried this before, paying down or paying off the debt. There have been 7 periods in the entire history of the United States of America, 7 periods where the government's budget moved into surplus. And when the government is in surplus, it means it's taking more money out of the economy, collecting more, than it's spending back in, right? So now I take out 10, but I only put 4 back in. So I have a surplus of 6. You have a deficit of 6. So once I begin running surpluses, then I begin retiring the debt. So we start paying down the debt. So from 1817 to 1821, the government's budget moved into surplus, and we began to pay down the national debt. What happened? A depression started in 1819. Not a recession, a full-on depression. Then we did it again, and this time under Andrew Jackson. The only time the US ever paid off the national debt was under President Andrew Jackson in 1835. We zeroed it out. And what happened? A depression started in 1837. We had surpluses again, began paying down the debt. You see the pattern, depression, 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 depression. And then we did it under Bill Clinton, okay? 1998, 99, 2000, 2001, 4 consecutive years, the US budget moved into surplus. For the first time in generations, we had budget surpluses. And they were celebrated because fiscal responsibility has been restored to Washington. The government's budget was in surplus. And we started to pay down the national debt. And what happened? The Great Recession followed. Okay, so why? Why is something that sounds so good, collecting, not spending more than you take in, running a surplus, paying down your debt, if we were doing that, that would be judicious, right? It would be a good thing to do. Why does it end so badly every single time the federal government does it? And the answer is here. This is actual data for the US going back to the 1950s. What you notice about this image is that it is a perfect mirror image. If you fold the graph from the bottom to the top, it will collapse entirely to the 0, axis, right, to the horizontal axis. It just all collapses into one. Why? Because it is showing the financial balances of each of the different parts of the economy. And so let me explain. This is the government in red. This is the private sector, right, all of you guys, in blue. And green is everything outside the domestic economy, so the whole rest of the world. Okay? So what it means is, again, if I'm government and I spend more than I collect, I put 2 in the economy, but I only take 1 back out. Then you guys have 1, yeah? So my deficit shows up as your surplus. And that's what happens here, okay? So for a period of time, in the early period, in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, the US was a net exporter. We manufactured and sold more to the rest of the world, in dollar terms, than they sold to us. So we were running trade surpluses. The rest of the world was running trade deficits against us. So the green below 0 there is a deficit being supplied by the rest of the world. If you add their deficits, the rest of the world, to the deficits I'm running as government, together our deficits produce your surplus, right? So add the red and green, and the mirror is the blue. Move forward in time. What happens? Our trade surpluses disappear. Now the US runs trade deficits, okay? So the rest of the world has the surplus. They're above 0. If the government's budget is not in deficit, and if those deficits aren't big enough, it is going to leave the US private sector below 0. So that is what happens, let's say, here. Well, no, here. That's what happens here. The rest of the world is running these huge trade surpluses. The government's deficit is too small. It's too small. And it leaves the private sector still in negative territory. Okay? But as the government's deficits get big enough, they more than compensate for the rest of the world taking more dollars out of the economy than they're putting in, and that pushes the private sector into its proper state of surplus. So look quickly here. The little red bit right here, those are the Clinton surpluses. So Clinton, the government's budget goes into surplus, so the government is going like this, more than it's going like this, at the same time as the rest of the world is taking more dollars out of the US than they're putting in. So the government's surplus, together with the rest of the world's surpluses, produce massive deficits for the US private sector. So it's the private sector. For the first time, you can see in generations, the US private sector, largely the household sector, begins spending more than its income. How long can households, users of currency, survive in deficit position? Not a long time, right? Because it's done largely through taking on more debt. That's what happened here, okay? But the government mostly lives in deficit and survives just fine that way because, again, it's the issuer of the currency. So the rules are different, right? One of us is sustainable. It's sustainable when one of us spends more than we take in, but not for the other one, okay? So now the last bit, what can we afford? Here's the way we think about it. We think that government budgeting works like this. The government goes out, collects taxes, borrows, has money, and then spends money. The order of operations that we believe is that first they collect all the money, then they spend. Yes? So the question is always, who's going to pick up the tab? How are you going to pay for it? Where will the money come from? Right? Tabs. That's our mental frame. This is not the way to think about it. Right? Because then we all get obsessed with who's going to pay for it. Where are you going to get the money? Whose taxes are going up? How are you going to finance it? How are you going to pay for it? Who's going to pick up the tab? And so somebody comes along with a big, ambitious agenda make public colleges and universities tuition free, health care for all, infrastructure, all this kind of stuff. And they said, we should be doing all these things, right? Which is what he said. And this is from her memoir, her book, after the presidential race. And there's this little bit in there where she says, you know, running against Bernie Sanders was like, we would say, let's do this. And he would say, let's do this. You know, she said he was always going bigger. And it was really frustrating. And we were like, you know, how are you going to pay for your pony, Bernie? So the pony is a metaphor for what? Big, ambitious spending programs. That's the metaphor. How are you going to pay for your pony? And he said, well, we can make public colleges and universities tuition free with a tax on Wall Street speculation. In economics, we call it a financial transactions tax or a Tobin tax. So we'll raise the money through a tax, and then we'll be able to spend the money, okay? So he's playing in that TABS framework. He said, infrastructure, let's say. How are you going to pay for it? Or healthcare. Well, infrastructure works better. The billionaires will pay for it, right? We'll have a tax on wealth or something else, right? We'll go where the money is, and we'll raise the money there. Look, this is what happens when you believe that the government is like a household and it has to find the money in order to fund itself, that it first has to go find money. So your prime minister said, famously, there is no magic money tree, right? It's not like the money can just come from nowhere. You have to find it. It has to come from somewhere. So in the case of Donald Trump, of course, we had this wall issue, and he promised that we were going to get a wall paid for by Mexico, right? Look how much problem this has created for him. If he had just started off saying, we're going to have a wall and the government's going to pay for the wall, it would have been a different conversation, right, for him. But he's stuck with this Mexico was supposed to pay for it kind of thing. And so, anyway, the debate that we should be having is completely different. And if we had more time, I would play this little video clip where Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve a few times ago, laid this out beautifully. And he explained, in his words, that there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone. That is a direct quote from Alan Greenspan under oath, giving testimony in Congress, okay? What he's saying is there's this fight over Social Security and this belief that governments can't keep their promises to future retirees, their dependents, the disabled, because where are we going to come up with the money? And Greenspan said, no, that's not the right question. We're going to always come up with the money, issue or the currency, right? He was Fed chair. He knows this stuff. The question is, he says, how do you make sure that if you send those checks out to future retirees, that when they get the money, they're going to be able to spend it in an economy that's productive enough that even with fewer people working and more people retired and therefore not contributing to the production of stuff, you'll be able to spend that money into an economy that's producing enough that you don't get what problem? Inflation. It's all about inflation. That's what he says. It's not about the financing. It's not about affordability. It's always about real resource constraints and the inflation constraint. This is what Greenspan argued. This is the debate we should be having, but we aren't having. Last couple of points. We will sometimes refer to the US as, are you an Arsenal fan? Definitely. I thought so. So I had to search for a scoreboard where they were in the lead. But I found one. So look, we will sometimes say the US government is the scorekeeper for the US dollar. This is all digital payments. So when Congress authorizes a budget, that provides the spending. It's just the votes. If they vote for it, they pass a budget, and the president signs it, the spending has been authorized and the money is there. The Fed's job as the fiscal agent of the government is to clear all the payments, is to make the payments on behalf of government. The Federal Reserve does not bounce government checks. Its job is not to bounce the government's checks, but to clear them. Okay, so the Fed will clear any payment that is authorized by Congress. How? They use the keyboard at the New York Fed, and they change numbers in people's accounts. If you sell to government, if you're Lockheed Martin or Boeing, and you get a big contract and government makes a purchase from you, you get a payment. They don't send you cash in like pallets of cash. They make a digital entry, and your bank account increases, right, by the size of whatever it is that the government has agreed to purchase. Government is the scorekeeper for the dollar. Here, the government is a scorekeeper for the British pound, right? You don't go to a sporting event and see your favorite teams competing, scoring point after point after point, and you're sitting there in the stands going, oh my God, I hope they don't score again. Where are they going to come up with the points? They're going to run out of points. No one ever would worry that the scorekeeper is going to run out of points. The scorekeeper can't run out of points. The government can't run out of dollars or pounds, right? They issue them. So how it really works, and this is the end, is that the government spends first, like I did. I pass a budget, the authorization is given, I begin spending into the economy. Spending comes first. You can't pay your taxes to me or buy treasuries from me until you first get what? The money, right? I have to spend it in before you can have it. So the spending comes first, the taxing and the borrowing are secondary operations. And so this pushes us now to space where we could have a completely different debate, because we don't have to ask the money question. Where will the money come from? It comes from the budgetary authorization. In your case, Parliament authorizes the spending. So that's where the money comes from. If we understood that, we would have a far more productive and interesting and important debate about how to muster the resources in the British economy. Like, what do we want to do? What problems do we want to address and solve? What are our missions? What are the goals? How should we use the budget to carry those out? And so that's the last slide. It's all about, you know, do you have enough real resources available that you can hire them, right? It's not a money tree, it's a real resource tree. How do you employ the resources you have and direct them in a mission-oriented way to solving real problems? So that's the end.
Great. So thanks
Good.
a lot, Stephanie.
You're welcome.
I purposely gave Stephanie some extra time because she's come all the way from the U.S. just to speak to this.
Welcome back. So what did you think? What do you think about capitalism versus socialism or social democracy or democratic socialism? What are your thoughts? Let us know down in the comments. Let's have that conversation. Do you have different ideas about these things now that you've seen this video and you understand how the financial economy actually works? What's the difference between federal finance versus a household finance? Does this change your perspective at all? Let us know. Let's have this conversation, because quite honestly, this is the conversation we need to have as a nation so we can actually move forward in a positive way, in an inclusive way, where everyone benefits, including the rich. Be back next week. Bye-bye.